Thank you very much for inviting me to do this keynote on the foreign accent paradox. I'm really honored. Thank you. I tried to use this mic, and I hope that it will work. Let's see whether the equipment is ready for me. Okay, the structure of my lecture here is like this. First, I will say something about various paradoxical aspects of foreign accented speech, and then I will focus on this paradox that we can observe, namely the paradox of intact speech learning abilities on the one hand, and the inevitability of a foreign accent. And I will then present several attempts to account for this paradox. So what's paradoxical about foreign accented speech? It's paradoxical because we'd like to avoid it, but it has several disadvantages. Foreign accented speech may have negative social consequences. It may have negative communicative consequences. It is an important part, not just of speech learning, but of language learning in general. And then, well, as the title of my talk says, it's inevitable in spite of intact speech learning abilities. So let's first give an example of the undesirable, disadvantageous social consequences that a foreign accent may have. Many studies have illustrated this. A fairly recent study by Levari and Kaiser asked various speakers with native accents, mild foreign accents, and strong foreign accents to produce sentences like, "Ants don't sleep." And I have no idea whether ants sleep or not, and these were all sentences where people simply didn't know whether ants sleep or not. And I could ask you, and most people would here say, "I don't know." The interesting part of this experiment is, however, that the trustworthiness of these statements depended very much on whether it was spoken with a native accent, with a mild foreign accent, and a heavy foreign accent. What you can see in this graph is that the truth ratings are a function of accentedness. So if you speak with a very strong foreign accent, you are not trustworthy. And I hope that my foreign accent is not strong enough that you will think that I'm not trustworthy today. Trust me. And there is one ultimate undesirable consequence of a foreign accent. It comes from the Bible. And for most of you, Hebrew might be as rusty as for me. That's why I provide you with an English translation, and I'll read this up for you. It's the first time ever that a foreign accent is mentioned, and with very drastic consequences. It goes like this. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he replied, "No," they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." If he said Sibolet because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. So the ultimate undesirable consequence of a foreign accent is untimely death. I've shown this before in a Danish context, and when I showed this in a Danish context, people stopped smiling about this because Danes would mispronounce Shibboleth as Sibolet. And I have a somewhat of a hunch that this might be the same pronunciation problem for Koreans. Aren't you lucky that you are not an Ephraimite? Right? Then another aspect of foreign accent that is paradoxical is that it's part of the general language learning paradox. When we looked at this table, we can see that we as adults like to believe that our cognitive, our mental abilities are so much superior than those of children. And I think we're right, basically. But when we look at language learning abilities, we can see that children are simply better language learners than we are. So how is it possible that we, with our superior mental abilities, are so much inferior when it comes to acquiring something that is really, really very complex? That is paradoxical. And finally, well, foreign accent is inevitable in spite of intact speech learning abilities. So the structure of the main part of the lecture now is, first of all, I will briefly say something about the inevitability of a foreign accent. I will then present 3 pieces of evidence that speech learning abilities are indeed intact. And then we will turn to the inevitability of a foreign accent where intact speech learning abilities fail. And to resolve this, I will present several attempts to account for the foreign accent paradox. To document the inevitability of a foreign accent, I will refer to a study that Jim Flaggy conducted several years ago, in which he invited 240 native speakers of Italian who had started to learn English between the ages of 2 and 23 years. So there were cohorts, 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, and so on and so forth. And they had resided in Canada for at least 15 years, which means that they had their chance. We would speak of near ultimate attainment at that age. And also a baseline group of 24 native English speakers. And these 264 speakers were invited to say sentences like, he turned to the right, Paul ate carrots and peas, and so on and so forth. And these sentences are sometimes seeded for non-native speakers, Italians, Koreans, Germans, and so on. These sentences were then presented to English judges to judge these sentences for degree of foreign accentedness. And you could also be a judge when you hear someone say, for instance, this sentence.
I can read this for you.
And I think everyone would say, that's pretty good, right? And here's another speaker, and she said,
the red book was good.
Not as unaccented as the first one. This is the result of the study. And what you see here is a very clear negative correlation. On the one hand, between degree of foreign accent, 254 is a strange number, but that was basically, it was translated from a ruler, basically, and 254 meant known foreign accent, and as we come closer to the zero, it means virtually unintelligible. So what you see here is the strong negative correlation, and it is reliable in this particular case. So this finding, which has been replicated and which is robust, and here's another graph that shows you more or less the same finding for 240 Korean English bilinguals who had arrived at various ages in the US. And you can see again that there is a decline in the ability to avoid a foreign accent. The filled dots over here, I should do this from here, on the far left side represent native speakers of English, and these are Koreans who had arrived in the US between the ages of, I think, 3 years up to the age of 20 years. A continuous decline in the ability to avoid a foreign accent. Now what this tells you is something that you knew all along. Younger is better. But the question is, why is younger better? Could it have anything to do with this particular person? And I've shown this picture before, and I've said, if you don't know who this person is, then ask for your money back from your first education, from your gymnasium, from your high school, because this is someone who you all should know. His name is Konrad Lorenz. It's an older person who is followed by 3 goslings. Now, why is he followed by these 3 goslings? Because he was around when they hatched. He was there when there was a window of opportunity to form the behavior of these goslings. And you can see similar graph here for ducklings. If you are around, if you move around ducklings or goslings when they hatch, they will imprint on you, and they would even follow me. It's unbelievable, but they would accept me as their mother. Okay? Only if this happens during the window of opportunity, which are the first 32 hours after hatching. Once this window of opportunity closes, they are not impressed anymore. Okay, they can't be imprinted anymore. And this idea has been translated to language acquisition research by Lenneberg. A very famous book, almost 50 years old, and it's called The Biological Basis of Language. And I have to read out a short excerpt here because it's so important, has influenced a lot of research. Lenneberg claimed that during this critical period, the individual appears to be most sensitive to stimuli and to preserve some innate flexibility for the smooth elaboration of speech and language. After puberty, the ability for self-organization and adjustment to the physiological demands of verbal behavior quickly declines. Verbal behavior means language. That's how you had to express it at that time. The brain behaves as if it has become set in its ways. And this last sentence sounds really depressing for all of us. It basically means we can't learn anything anymore after puberty. And for all of us, this is over. So, but what this finding shows you, it's basically the kiss of death of many for the maturational account. Because A, we see a gradual decline in the strength and the ability to avoid a foreign accent. There's not a sudden decline. There's not a window of opportunity where you can acquire a foreign accent, acquire a second language without a foreign accent, and then suddenly this window closes. It's gradual. Secondly, this decline starts at a very early age, long before puberty and long before the age of 6, which some people have assumed to be the closing time of this window of opportunity. And it continues throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So there are many pieces of evidence that say, well, it has nothing to do with neurophysiological maturation, and I'll give later an account for why this should be actually different. So if the age effect is not due to maturation, not due to how our brain changes as we become older, what is it due to? And here I have to ask you to be patient, because later on I will get to this point. Okay? So let's turn to intact speech learning abilities. I just given you some evidence that yes, foreign accent does exist, and we knew that all along, but with some important consequences for at least one theory of language learning. And the background on intact speech learning abilities could be a study that showed the development from universal to language-specific speech perception. And this is a summary that I present of studies by Worker and Tees, where they looked at the discriminability of a speech contrast that exists in Hindi but not in English. It doesn't exist in Korean either. What you see here is the mid-sagittal contour of, on the left side, a retroflex T, that's a ta, and on the right side, a dental T, that's a ta. And if you can't hear the difference, you're in a very large club. What Worker and Tees and her colleagues wanted to find out is whether these two speech sounds are discriminable at various age ranges, and I will present to you 4 retroflex and 4 dental Ts by a Hindi speaker. Well, then you simply have to trust me when I say ta. I told you before. When I say ta and ta, okay? Very difficult to hear. However, it's not difficult to hear for English learning children between the age of 6 and 8 months. They are perfect discriminator of these contrasts. They do this just as well as native speakers of Hindi. English adults, however, their performance on the discrimination of these two sounds is absolutely pathetic. So the parents can't do it, their children, their babies can do it. So the question that Worker and colleagues asked, when does this change? When do we turn from being a universal, as these babies are, to a language-specific perceiver? And they tested 12-year-olds because they are apparently before puberty, they are just as bad as the adults. 8-year-olds who are definitely before puberty, and they are even worse, they can't hear anything, nothing at all. 4-year-olds because they're totally illiterate, and so on and so forth. And I'll make this a little bit brief. This is the bottom line. And when this result first came out a long time ago, people thought this was truly amazing, because what it showed is that before children start to speak, really, they're still at the babbling phase, they realize that they have some ability, they can discriminate ta and ta, but I'm growing up in a language environment where this is perfectly useless. So I put this on the back burner, and that is really the question. Are the abilities that we all once had, for instance, for ta versus ta, for, and this is important in the Korean context, for ra versus la. Korean babies, I will bet with you, they can do it. Korean adults, as you might know, have a problem with that. Okay? Are these abilities that we all possessed as babies, are they permanently lost, or are they dormant or latent? And if they are dormant or latent, how can these abilities that we all once had be resurrected? So, are they lost or dormant? I will present 3 pieces of evidence, just like in a court of law, 3 pieces of evidence that will convince you that we indeed have intact speech learning abilities. One shows that the apparent decline in speech perception abilities reflects a shift in attention, not neural atrophy. And this is evidence from the lab. Also evidence from the lab is through speech perception and production abilities that can be successfully shaped through training regimes. And thirdly, my third piece of evidence will be speech perception and production abilities that change as a function of second language experience. And this is evidence from naturalistic learning. So let's first look at the claim that apparent decline in speech perception abilities reflects a shift in attention, not in neural atrophy. This is a very old study, but an extremely important study by Miyawaki, which showed that apparent loss is due to linguistic processing. They presented what we call three-step auditor discrimination. For instance, they presented listeners with syllables of like ra, la, or ra, la, ra, and they had to decide which one would be the odd one out. And these listeners were native English and native Japanese listeners. This is how the endpoints of this continuum look like. On the bottom, you can see a very good ra syllable with a very low third formant frequency. And on the top, you can see a very good la with a high third formant frequency. So these are the endpoints of the continuum. This is how native speakers of Japanese and native speakers of American discriminate this continuum. Native speakers of American English, of course, have a discrimination peak at the phoneme boundary, because this is where it's important to discriminate. Native speakers of Japanese, well, they are hovering around just above chance. There is some residual discrimination ability, but they're not really good at this. Okay? Well, what Miyawaki and all then did is they said, okay, they can't hear it when they perceive this as syllables, as speech syllables, something like ra and la. Let's just focus on that part of these syllables that carry the phonetic information without being linguistic. And that is shown here on the right-hand side. This is just the third formant contour. Doesn't sound like speech at all, but this is what distinguishes these syllables. It's not language, it's just a sound. And this is what I've shown you before for ra and la. This is what I can show you for listening for Japanese and American English listeners, discriminating just the form and contour of the critical non-speech cue for ra and la. And their Americans and Japanese are just on the same level. This is a very strong indication that linguistic processing, if we hear sounds as a linguistic sound, as speech, then we process it according to the rules of our native language. If we can't hear it as speech, if we hear it as a sound, well, then we're able to discriminate this. And this is very strong evidence for linguistic processing blocking access to critical acoustic information. Okay? Another piece of evidence comes from Worker and Logan's study that you can manipulate the interstimulus interval and thereby induce or show that something is indeed discriminable. What Worker and Logan did is they presented ta and ta, let me see whether this works, with a long interstimulus interval of 1.5 seconds. Okay. And what happens when the interstimulus interval is long is it's processed phonetically, it's processed linguistically, and then we have to recall what we encoded linguistically. However, if the interstimulus interval is very short, just 1/4 of a second, and I can't conduct the experiment here, so simply have to trust me. Okay, then listeners can hear the difference because they are not encoding it linguistically. They can rely on the accurate trace of the stimulus that they have heard. So we have good discrimination with a short interstimulus interval, poor discrimination with a long interstimulus interval where we encode linguistically. So these were two pieces of evidence that the apparent decline in speech perception abilities reflects a shift in attention, not neural atrophy. It's doable if stimuli are presented as non-speech, for example. Let's now look at speech perception and production abilities, which can successfully be shaped through training regimes, and this is evidence from the lab. Most training studies today use what's called the HVPT. Well, that is high variability perceptual training with multiple talkers, multiple stimuli, multiple contexts to enable robust and generalized learning, not just one talker, not just one syllable, one word. And the way this is typically done is like in medical trials. You have a control group that doesn't receive the treatment, and you have an experimental group that receives the treatment. So both groups are in pretest, then the experimental group, as you can see here, goes through training, and then there's a post-test. And hopefully the difference between pre-test and post-test will exist for the experimental group. There will be no real difference between pre-test and post-test. What's sometimes also done are several additional post-tests. generalization to no tokens, transfer to production, and delayed post-test to see whether the training was indeed robust and successful and lasted for more than just a few days. The example that I have here is from Annabel Orato, who trained native speakers of Portuguese on several English vowels. The training was 5 times 60 minutes. This kind of training is really, really boring, but as you will see, it is indeed successful. What you can see here is the EG, which is the experimental group, and the CG, which is the control group. And at pre-test, you can see that these groups are equivalent, roughly equivalent, between 70 and 55% correct. At post-test, only the experimental group showed an increase in discrimination ability. For all 3 contrasts, the control group remained at the same level, which clearly indicates that training was successful. Now you could ask, well, it's successful, that's just fine, but what happens once they've left the lab and a couple of weeks later? 2 months later, the experimental group remained at the high level. There's actually a slight, non-significant increase. They are actually on a trajectory, whereas the control group, well, they remain at their low level of incompetence. So that shows that it's one piece of evidence that this can be done through perceptual training. Another piece of evidence comes from a study that I did with Lila Trapp, where we looked at the trainability of the English z contrast. This is the Danish pronunciation of peas.
Peace.
And you can hear that this is peace. No voicing, no final voicing. And what we did is we trained school kids, 12-year-olds, and the training was really very short, 4 times 30 minutes only. As you can see here again, control group and experimental group were equivalent at pre-test. Only at post-test do you have an increase, not brilliant, but a definitely significant increase for the experimental group, showing that training really makes a difference. And finally, I'd like to show you another training study very briefly by Serino and Wang, where they trained native speakers of English in Mandarin tones. And these are the F0 contours for Mandarin tones. Here are the 4 words that are segmentally MR, and they differ only in tones.
Ma, 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 ma.
Well, difficult for speakers of non-tone languages to learn. This is the overall results. The trainee and the control group were equivalent at pre-test. At post-test, at generalization to new speakers, at generalization to no tokens, the trainee group was really, really good. I mean, almost 100% is very impressive. The control group just remained at its own low level. Okay? This was a training of just perception, but oddly enough, well, actually it's not odd, this also transferred to production. What you see here are 4 graphs which show the tone contours, the native norm. The short dotted lines are pre-test, the long dotted lines are post-test. And in all cases, for post-test, after perception training, the production was nearer to the native target, even though they were not trained on production, in all 4 cases for all 4 tones. So, I think this convincingly shows that speech perception and production abilities can be successfully shaped through training regimes. This was evidence from the lab. Let's now look at speech perception and production abilities which change as a function of L2 experience with learners who are naturalistically exposed to the language because they may be immigrants. Maybe you remember this. Okay, I just showed this. Trying to document that linguistic processing blocks access to critical acoustic information, right? And if the claim that speech perception and production abilities change as a function of experience, this should mean that the shifted attention for native Japanese speakers in this case, who were able to discriminate this as babies, but couldn't do this as adults, this is what the arrow pointers do, could be reshifted, so that they actually can learn to discriminate and to identify R and L just like native speakers of English. Now, I have been involved in various studies that were first conducted by Best and Strange, where we looked at the perception of American English approximants by various first language groups, and I'll present only the Japanese results here. This is a continuum. Let me see whether this actually works. Yes, this is a stimulus continuum from 1 through 10. 1 is a very good rock, 10 is a very good lock, And maybe this even works here with a Korean, in a Korean environment. When I play you these sounds, please raise your hands when you hear lock and not rock anymore.
Rock, 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 lock.
Yes, you are just like Americans. I know I'm just a guest speaker, but I shouldn't say this, but I'm proud of you. Because what you showed is categorical perception, just like native speakers of American English. Okay? If I presented to you these stimuli in a randomized fashion, you would show this identification function. You would not look like this. These are native speakers of Japanese, inexperienced. They've only been exposed to some kind of English in Japan. And until recently, this was just, was virtually no oral input. And as you can see, they're hovering around 50%. This basically means they have absolutely no idea what they're listening to. But these are native speakers of Japanese who had a chance. They were exposed to authentic English, had spent several years in the US. And as you can see for yourself, they are very much like native speakers of English and very unlike the other native speakers of Japanese who had virtually no exposure. It shows that this is learnable even for adults. Here's another example from a study that I did with Jim Flagey several years ago. In English, there is a spectral difference between E and I. These are two different vowels, E and I. Native speakers of Mandarin who had just arrived in the US, they had been there for 4 months, do not produce this difference, not reliably. It simply doesn't exist. It's almost not audible what you hear there. These are native speakers of Mandarin after 6 years. So they learned this difference. Okay? Another example comes from Germans. Here's the spectral difference between epsilon and ash, bet and bat. Again, native speakers of German who had spent 9 years learning English in school couldn't do this when they arrived in the US. 6 years later, a different group, of course, indeed produce a reliable difference between bet and bat. Okay, so what we have here is the third piece of evidence that speech perception and production abilities change as a function of second language experience. And we might say, well, intact speech learning mechanisms, that's just great. Okay, isn't that wonderful? It's a good message. It's not the case that our brain is set in its ways. And then you might say, well, really? What about foreign accented speech? Why is a foreign accent inevitable if speech learning mechanisms are intact? Well, let's look at that. If speech learning mechanisms are intact, which they are, I documented that, why is a foreign accent inevitable? Let's first look at some data that might help resolve this apparent paradox. Recall this. These are the Germans who were able to learn to produce a difference between epsilon and ash, bet and bat. I'm saying epsilon and ash because I'm a native speaker of German. And when I'm slightly nervous, like when I'm presenting a talk, I might say bet and bet with a German accent. So I better talk about epsilon and ash. So here's documentation that Germans can produce a reliable difference between epsilon and ash. Here's another English vowel contrast, which is E versus I. And in English, there is no duration contrast. English doesn't have a long E and a short E. This is not anything that a teacher should tell you because this is really, it really misleads students. English has a vowel contrast, a spectral vowel contrast, not a duration contrast between E and I. German also has E and I, but it's also a duration contrast. The German E is twice as long as the German I. So what happens when Germans learn English? We would hope that they would reduce this duration contrast. Well, these are the inexperienced learners of German. They kind of aim at English, but they're not very successful. 6 years later, same thing. So does this mean that the learning mechanism is intact for epsilon and ash and defunct for E and I? What's happening there? Okay. Here's another piece of evidence that really is confusing, or I found it very confusing. When Major did a study of L1 Brazilian Portuguese speakers with L2 English, he looked at the relation of global accent ratings. Global accent ratings are ratings of full sentences, where you also where listeners also integrate the intonation information, segmental information, and so on and so forth. And then he looked at individual ratings for the vowels for the syllables bet and bat. And what he found is this, first of all, which doesn't really surprise you because it shows that as foreign accent, global foreign accent becomes better, 200 is virtually native-like, also the mean judgments for bats go up. So yes, the vowel is more intelligible, is more native-like, and global foreign accent is more native-like. What he also reported was this, for epsilon. As global foreign accent ratings improve, are better, the judgments for one particular vowel go down. Improvement in language learning means that the ability to produce one particular vowel native-like really goes down, and that is quite confusing. It's like a crossover. How can this be possible? Okay? So, are you confused by now? Well, if you're not confused, then you're not really paying attention. Okay? So let's see how we can sort this out. Some of the sounds of the second language are learnable, even for adults. I've shown you this for RL for Japanese, EF for Mandarin, epsilon ash for Germans, and I didn't have the time to show Ü, I'll get back to that later, Ü for native speakers of Spanish, A for native speakers of Portuguese. And some sounds of the second language remain foreign accented. EF for Germans, Ü for native speakers of English, English aspirated T for native Spanish adults, epsilon for L1 Portuguese. And part of a key to an understanding of what's going on is this. We have the same contrast that is learnable for Mandarin speakers, but not for German speakers. We have Ü that is learnable for native Spanish speakers, but not for native speakers of English. And that can help us to understand what in fact is going on there. The attempts to resolve this paradox are provided by the two most commonly used models of second language speech learning and cross-language speech perception, and I will focus here on Flaggy's speech learning model and on Best's perceptual assimilation model and its extension to second language learning. First of all, Flaggy's speech learning model and how it would treat the apparently paradoxical results that I've shown you so far. The primary aim of the speech learning model is to account for the influence of age of learning and length of residence on speech learning success by referring to changes in or referring to perceived similarity of sounds between the sounds of the first and the second language. And what you see here is a simplified illustration of how this could be. What you see on the y-axis is L2 production accuracy between accented and on the top unaccented. And on the x-axis, you see the predictions for no difference and a large difference between L1 and L2 sounds. Now, identical sounds should never be accented. If native speakers of Korean were introduced to English eng, and you heard your professor say, let's do some exercises on eng, you would say, what a waste of time, because it's the same in Korean and in English. Okay? But on the other hand, we have new sounds, sounds that simply do not exist in our language, like th, which is a very rare sound, except for English and some other languages. And then we have similar sounds, and these are dangerous. These are the ones that according to this model, are the ones that remain foreign accented. And I will show this in some more detail using this particular table. What you can see here on in the first row is identical sounds would be English and Korean ng. Very similar sounds are, for instance, English t and the very heavily affricated and aspirated English Danish t. You would drink in English a cup of tea, and this number in Danish is tsi, and you may be able to hear the difference. Similar sounds are English I and I and German long I and I. Very dissimilar sounds are English I and I and Korean short and long I. And then you have new sounds, English r, which simply doesn't exist in Korean. And what you see in the other rows are the predictions for child, adolescent, and adult learners. And what we see here is actually a diagonal. We can see that for children, everything is learnable. And as we become older, we find that similarity is more detrimental for older than for younger learners. The older we are, the more difficult it is to learn sounds that are more are similar to the sounds of our native inventory. So back to the earlier question. If the age effect is not due to maturation, what is it due to? Okay? And one hypothesis in the speech learning model helps. This hypothesis states that the likelihood of phonetic differences between L1 and L2, the first language and the second language sounds being discerned, decreases as age of learning increases. That's apparently the reason. And I'll present a study which could show this. So why would the likelihood of phonetic differences between L1 and L2 sounds being discerned decrease as age of learning increases? Why is it more difficult for us than for children to attend to the differences between sounds in the native and in the foreign language? It is because phonetic categories established in childhood for first language sounds evolve over time, and they have to reflect the properties of all phones identified as realizations of a category. Let's try to show this in a graph. This is a schematic example of the evolution of phonetic categories over childhood, adolescence, and adulthood to reflect the properties of phones identified as realizations of a category. As a child, you're merely exposed, well, to your siblings, to your parents, to your surroundings. Then as an adolescent, you may have exposure to other dialects, to more speakers. So the categories expand to account for more realizations of these phones. As an adult, you really have a lot of experience. So the categories become wider and wider and wider. What happens when, this could be native speakers of Spanish. Spanish has a 5-vowel system. What happens when a native speaker of Spanish encounters a vowel like I? Okay? This is what happens for children. It falls into empty territory. No overlap with native categories. Children might say, oh, this is new. I can easily establish a new category. Adolescents, well, there is already some overlap. And then us adults, almost complete overlap. And what we do is, well, we perform what's called equivalence classification. We classify these sounds of equivalence because they are more or less the same as the ones that we have. Whereas children still can establish new categories because this is in new territory in a sense. Okay? So the evolution of phonetic categories over the lifespan accounts for age effects. Formation of categories for our first language sounds is likely to be blocked by equivalence classification in older learners. So this could account, for instance, why native German speakers do not produce I correctly, but are fairly successful at English A. You recall this? The lack of success in producing the temporal contrast between I and in an English-like fashion, and the success at producing a spectral contrast between epsilon and ash. Now these are English and German front vowels. This is German I, German German and German A. And when we see what English has to offer in terms of front vowels, we have I and and we have A, which does not exist in German. German has a hole in the low front corner of the vowel space. It falls into empty territory, which means it's learnable, basically. Just like other sounds that I do not match in any way our native language inventory are, in fact, learnable. So the SLM, or the speech learning model assumption that learnability is a function of perceived dissimilarity, has been supported in a very large number of studies. The speech learning model also claims that we as bilinguals, and if you're listening to me right now, you are also a bilingual, we strive to maintain contrast between the first and the second phonetic categories which exist in a common phonological space. And this could account for this very strange finding that I showed you before, namely that as global foreign accent improves, local foreign accent may improve for some L2 sounds and may deteriorate for others. How can this account for it? Okay? This finding, and something that we also found, namely, if you look at this particular graph, this is the intelligibility of epsilon by native English speakers, highly intelligible, then by Germans who had spent 6 years in the US, and their epsilon is less intelligible than the epsilon produced by Germans who had just arrived in the US. Also somewhat counterintuitive, paradoxical. How is that possible? Let's look at how this is possible. This could be the vowel system of Italian. Italian has 7 vowels. Okay? This could be the vowel system of English, quite a few more vowels. What happens in language learning is apparently this. Either categories are assimilated, foreign categories are assimilated to the ones we have, for instance, E and I and so on and so forth. But what will also happen is if new categories are formed, you get dissimilation, to try to tear them apart to make them as different as possible. And this is what we observed with epsilon and ash for the Germans and also for the native Portuguese learners. So this exemplifies the dynamics in what's called the common phonological space of bilinguals. Now, so far, I've talked about the speech learning model, which can account for the paradox of intact learning ability and the inevitability of foreign accent by stipulating age differences in how learners perceive the relations between L1 and L2 sounds, which leads to age differences in the ability to form new categories, and the existence of L1 and L2 phonetic categories in a common phonological space, which leads to dissimilation or assimilation or merger of sound categories. A somewhat different angle on the perceptual basis of foreign accent is presented in the other very widely used model, model of cross-language speech perception. This is Best's perceptual assimilation model. And the primary aim originally was to explain cross-language speech perception by naive listeners, those who had not had contact with a foreign language. And the specific aim is to account for why the degree of perceptual difficulty varies greatly across non-native contrasts. And Pam predicts that different assimilation patterns, different patterns of how we assimilate sounds of the foreign language to the native language, cause differences in perceptual difficulty. And Pam L2 aims to account for the perceptual changes that occur in the second language learning. This could be our native phonological space. Okay? The colored dots in there are our native phonemes, and then there is some space that is not inhabited. We have, there could be sounds that are uncategorized as native categories. And then there are speech sounds that are simply not assimilated. This could be the click sounds of South African languages, like, for instance, Xhosa. What happens when we hear contrasts of a non-native language, the assimilation of non-native, how these contrasts are assimilated, there could be two-category assimilation. I will give an example in a second, which is unproblematic. They fall into two categories. We may also find that two sounds or sound contrast is assimilated to one category, but in a category difference assimilation type. And we may have single category assimilation where two sounds of the foreign language are assimilated to just one native category. And an example of that, as I will give, that could be, for instance, R and L for native Korean. It's identified as the same sound in Korean. Okay? So here are some examples, and I think I don't have the time to go through all of these, but two-category assimilation could be, for instance, English unaspirated and aspirated T to Korean unaspirated and aspirated T. And the discrimination ability of Koreans, I'm willing to bet with you, is perfect. You will do a very good job. Okay? Then we may have the case where an uncategorized speech sounds versus a native exemplar. And apparently, from the studies that I've seen, English unaspirated and aspirated velar stops do not really match well onto Korean. The English aspirated velar stop matches well onto the Korean, but the unaspirated is all over the place. And I'll have to show more about this in the tutorial lecture that I'll give tomorrow. But still, discrimination is supposed to be quite good because there is, in a sense, there is an anchor. I'll be fairly brief and skip some of these. Uncategorized would be the assimilation of English th or the to Korean. Because in the studies that I have seen, if Koreans are asked, give us an example of how you would have to label this if you had Korean speech sounds, Koreans just don't know what to do with the and the. They are all over the place. It just doesn't fit a particular category. And that makes it the discrimination not quite as good as for the other cases. The worst example is, of course, single category assimilation, where exemplars of a single native category, equivalents, which have an equivalent goodness of fit, you get a very poor, typically poor discrimination, as for instance, you would get for L and R, for Korean L, for learners that are not really familiar with English. So there is a considerable support and a large number of studies from both of these models. Some second language phenomena are not accounted for either by PEM and the SLM, and I'll say more about this in the tutorial lecture tomorrow. And I want to give, by closing off, one example of successful prediction of language learning success or failure based on these models. It's a study that I recently did on the production of Danish Ü by highly experienced native Spanish and native English listeners. They had resided in Denmark for 15 years, and you would also say 15 years you had your chance. Okay? So that's nearly the asymptote of language learning. When we compare the phoneme inventories for close vowels, Danish has E, Ü, and U, 3 vowels. English and Spanish just have 2, E and U. So in the old days, in the days of contrastive analysis, some people would probably assume that that same learning problem exists for native English and native Spanish learners, but that is simply not the case, because the phonetic realization of close vowels in Danish, Spanish, and English suggests that this is not the case. Okay, and I'll give you evidence of this. So what you can see here are the E's, first of all, the E's of Danish, Spanish, and English in terms of second form and frequency, very high form and frequency. Then you see the U's of Danish and Spanish, low second form and frequency, which indicates that the tongue is at the back of the mouth. But English U is quite fronted. It's somewhere between E and U. Okay? And then you have Danish Ü, which is, between E and U. So this, the F2, second form and frequency, is a good measure of tongue positions front versus back. So English, what we can see here is that Danish Ü is quite dissimilar from any Spanish vowel, and somewhat similar to English U, the fronted U, which is U bar here. So how do L1 Spanish and L1 English listeners perceive Danish E, Ü, and U? As another part of this study, we did a mapping experiment where we asked native speakers of these 2 languages to map these 3 Danish vowels to the native E and U and provide goodness ratings. This is how these studies are typically done. What you can see here, first of all, is that Danish E is mapped onto English and Danish E with fairly high goodness ratings in all instances. And in the bottom row, you can see that Danish U is mapped onto Spanish U and English U with also fairly good, high goodness ratings. For Ü, however, you can see that this native Spanish speakers just don't know what to do with it. It's split between E and U, and the goodness ratings are quite low. For native English speakers, this is just another way of saying U. And the difference in goodness ratings for native English speakers between Ü and U is just 0.8, whereas the difference in goodness ratings for native Spanish speakers is 1.6. So they really realize that Ü is just, we don't really like this and we don't know what to do with this, whereas native English speakers basically say, well, it's a kind of strange U. Right? So results in terms of the speech learning model indicate that Danish Ü is perceived to be more similar to English U by English listeners than to Spanish U by Spanish listeners. So the prediction of the speech learning model would be that native Spanish learners will be ultimately more successful at producing Danish Ü than native English listeners. The PAM prediction, the perceptual assimilation model, or the interpretation of these results would be that Danish Ü is uncategorized for native Spanish listeners. It does not fit any native category well. And this prediction from the model would be that native Spanish learners will ultimately be more successful at producing Danish Ü than native English listeners. And yes, this was borne out. What we see here is that, let me do straight to the graph, and the one that is circled here with a red balloon, you can say that Danish Ü and Spanish accented Danish Ü do not differ significantly. Whereas native speakers of English, and they have the same amount of experience with Danish, produce an Ü that is simply not front enough. It's still English accented, whereas the Spanish accented Danish U is simply not Spanish accented, it's right on target. So the predictions by both models are supported. It's a matter of how these sounds map onto the native language, whether they can be seen as not fitting any category, being really new, or being classified, being subject to equivalence classification. Okay, let me conclude. So this lecture on the foreign accent paradox, the paradox that we have foreign accented speech in spite of intact learning abilities, was an attempt to address the why question regarding this apparent inevitability of a foreign accent for anyone except very young language learners. The bottom line is that the phonetic systems of 2 or more languages have to coexist and interact in one mind. Sound systems of languages can be learned at any age. Well, we'll get to that in a second. And sound systems of languages interact in the minds of bilinguals. And these studies, a large number of L2 speech studies, have been inspired by or have supported the general assumptions and the specific predictions generated by these models. And these studies have provided very solid evidence showing that human language learning ability extends over the whole lifespan. And I'd like to be able to say this, but I have to make a reservation because evidence only exists up to age of 50 years. We really don't know what about older populations. Yes, there is age-induced hearing loss, but there is really no indication that language learning ability suddenly goes downhill after the age of 50. Age effects are due to attentional, not biological factors. Second language speech research presents very solid evidence against the pessimistic view of human language ability as expressed by the critical period hypothesis. These age effects play an important role in L2 speech learning, but these effects are gradual and they are not related to any known changes in neurophysiological development. Rather, these age effects are related to the evolution of phonetic categories as a function of language experience throughout the lifespan, and these age effects are caused by reversible shifts in attention. Second language speech learning involves a shift in attention to critical phonetic cues of the L2, which may not have been exploited in the first language, or which have been exploited differently. The difficulty of this shift depends largely on the perceived relationship of second language phones to native categories. And the nature of this perceived relationship, as expressed in current models of second language speech learning, is a very good, but not perfect, as those of you who will be at the tutorial lecture will see, predictor of second language speech perception and production problems. And with these words, I'd like to say thank you. And I'd also like to acknowledge support from the Danish National Research Foundations and I'd like to acknowledge the colleagues with which I've worked and from whom I've learned so much. In chronological sequence, Jim Flegge, where I was a postdoc, Winifred Strange, Linda Polka, Catherine Best, Terry Gottfried, and Diane Cooley-Port. And now I'll try to say something in Korean, and please don't laugh at me. 감사합니다.